The dust on the horizon shimmered like a mirage as Lillian Voight collapsed to her knees, the harsh Montana sun beating down on her battered frame. She'd been walking for days, her swollen ankle throbbing with every step, but the precious bundle strapped to her back kept her moving forward. The baby, only 4 months old, had mercifully fallen asleep despite the unforgiving heat of the summer of 1878. Lillian's once fine dress hung in tatters around her rail-thin body, and her chestnut hair, matted with dust and sweat, clung to her sunburnt face. The ranch house in the distance wavered in her vision home, or what once had been. Jackson Reed saw her from the porch where he'd been repairing a saddle. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks, a common occurrence in these vast, lonely plains. But as the figure drew closer, stumbling across the dried grassland, recognition dawned with a jolt that nearly stopped his heart. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, dropping his tools and vaulting over the porch railing. His boots pounded against the hard, packed earth as he ran toward her. Lillian's legs finally gave out completely just as Jackson reached her. She crumpled forward, her arms instinctively reaching back to protect the baby. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. "Lillian, my God, Lillian, is that you?" Jackson's voice cracked as he gently steadied her. Her cracked lips parted. "Water," she rasped, "for the baby." Jackson carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she winced in pain. "You've got a little one?" he asked, trying to keep the shock from his voice as he noticed the small bundle on her back for the first time. With trembling hands, Lillian reached back to adjust the makeshift sling. "My daughter," she whispered. As they approached the ranch house, Lillian's steps faltered again. Jackson glanced down at her badly swollen ankle and made a swift decision. With gentle movements, he scooped her into his arms, baby and all, cradling her against his chest. "You've walked far enough, Lillian," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "Stay." Her tear-filled eyes met his, and in them he saw a story of hardship and heartbreak that made his chest ache. Jackson carried her the rest of the way to the house, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The ranch house stood as Lillian remembered it, weathered yet sturdy, a testament to the Reed family's stubborn determination to tame this unforgiving land. As Jackson carried her through the doorway, memories flooded back. The summer she'd spent here 4 years ago, working as a teacher for the neighboring family's children, the quiet evenings on the porch, the stolen glances and tentative touches, and finally, the heartbreaking goodbye when her father had summoned her back east. Inside, the house was cooler, the thick walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Jackson gently set Lillian down on a chair by the kitchen table. "Let me get that water," he said, moving quickly to the pump at the sink. He filled a tin cup and brought it to her lips, supporting the back of her head as she drank greedily. The baby stirred against Lillian's back, making soft, mewling sounds. With shaking hands, Lillian attempted to untie the sling. "Here, let me help you," Jackson offered, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness as he helped free the infant from the fabric. Lillian cradled the baby to her chest, tears of relief sliding down her dirt-streaked face. "This is Emma," she said softly, looking down at the infant's flushed face. Emma rose. Jackson knelt beside them, his eyes fixed on the tiny human in Lillian's arms. The baby had a dusting of dark hair and a button nose that scrunched as she woke fully and began to cry. "She must be hungry," Lillian said, the exhaustion evident in her voice. "I haven't been able to feed her properly since yesterday." "I'll give you some privacy," Jackson said, standing up quickly. "The bedroom's still where it was. I'll bring in some fresh water and something for you to eat." Lillian nodded gratefully and attempted to stand, but her injured ankle gave way. Jackson caught her arm. "Let me," he said simply, and once again lifted her in his arms. He carried her to the small bedroom off the kitchen. It was sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a small table with a basin. Jackson set her down on the edge of the bed. "Rest, feed your little one. I'll be right outside if you need anything." As he turned to leave, Lillian caught his hand. "Jackson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and gently closed the door behind him. In the kitchen, Jackson leaned against the counter, his mind reeling. Lillian Voight had returned after 4 years of silence, and with a child. The implications made his heart race and his stomach knot. The baby looked to be a few months old at most. Who was the father? What had happened to Lillian in the years since she'd left? And what had driven her back to this remote ranch on foot and in such a desperate state? Jackson filled a basin with cool water and gathered some clean rags, a bar of soap, and a jar of salve. From the pantry, he retrieved some dried beef, a loaf of bread, and a jar of peach preserves he'd been saving for a special occasion. He set a pot of coffee on the stove and waited, his thoughts a tumultuous storm. When he judged enough time had passed, he knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Lillian, may I come in?" "Yes," came the soft reply. Jackson entered to find Lillian sitting up in bed, the baby asleep in her arms. She had attempted to clean her face with the edge of a sheet, but dirt still streaked her cheeks and forehead. "I brought some water for washing, and food," Jackson said, setting down his burdens on the small table. "And I thought I should take a look at that ankle." Lillian nodded tiredly. "Thank you. Could you hold Emma while I wash?" Jackson hesitated, then nodded, setting down the basin and approaching the bed. With careful movements, Lillian transferred the sleeping infant to his arms. Jackson stood frozen, afraid to move lest he disturb the tiny creature. Emma sighed in her sleep, her little fingers curling against his work-worn shirt. Something fierce and protective surged through him as he looked down at her peaceful face. Lillian watched them for a moment, her expression unreadable, then reached for the basin. She washed her face and hands with slow, deliberate movements, wincing occasionally. When she finished, she looked younger, though deep shadows remained under her eyes. "I can hold her again now," she said, and Jackson carefully returned the baby to her arms. He pulled a chair close to the bed and gestured toward her swollen ankle. "May I?" At her nod, he gently examined the injury, his fingers probing with experienced care. Lillian bit her lip but didn't make a sound. "It's not broken, I don't think," Jackson said finally, "but it's a bad sprain. You shouldn't be walking on it at all, much less." He trailed off, the question hanging in the air between them. Lillian looked down at Emma, stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. "I had no choice," she said simply. Jackson waited, giving her space to continue if she wished. After a long silence, Lillian spoke again, her voice stronger. "I was married, Jackson. His name was Thomas Blackburn, a banker from Boston. My father arranged it." Jackson nodded, unsurprised. Frederick Voight had made no secret of his ambitions for his only daughter or his disdain for the simple ranch life of the West. "Thomas seemed kind at first," Lillian continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "But after the wedding, he changed. Her voice faltered. He had a temper. And a fondness for whiskey that made it worse." Jackson's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent. "When I discovered I was with child, I hoped things would improve. They didn't. After Emma was born, I feared." She swallowed hard. "I feared for her safety, for both of us. So one night I took what little money I could find and we left." "You came all the way from Boston?" Jackson asked, incredulous. Lillian shook her head. "No, Thomas had business interests in Denver. We'd been living there for the past year." She hesitated. "I took the train as far as Cheyenne. Then my money ran out. I walked the rest of the way." Jackson stared at her in disbelief. "Cheyenne, that's over 100 miles, Lillian." She met his gaze steadily. "I had nowhere else to go, no one who would understand, except—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Except you." The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken history. Jackson stood abruptly, turning to the window to hide the emotion on his face. "You need rest," he said gruffly, "and food. We can talk more later." He helped her eat some bread with preserves and drink a cup of watered-down coffee, then left her to sleep. Taking the empty dishes with him in the kitchen, Jackson sank into a chair, running a hand through his sun-bleached hair. Lillian Voight had walked over 100 miles with a baby and an injured ankle to reach his door. The implications staggered him. 4 years ago, when she'd left, they'd been on the verge of something he'd thought about every day since. But her father had called her home, and duty-bound Lillian had gone. Jackson had written letters that went unanswered. Eventually, he'd stopped writing, nursing his wounded heart in silence, and now she was back, married and with a child, fleeing an abusive husband. Jackson knew what the law said about such situations. A woman was her husband's property, and any man who harbored her could face serious consequences. But as he thought of Lillian's battered body and the fear in her eyes, he knew he didn't give a damn about the law. "She can stay," he muttered to himself, resolution hardening within him. "They both can." The baby's cry woke him from a fitful sleep on the sofa. Jackson sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering the events of the previous day. The crying continued, accompanied by Lillian's soft, soothing voice. He pulled on his boots and went to check on them. A knock at the bedroom door was answered with a tired, "Come in." Lillian sat in the rocking chair by the window, Emma fussing in her arms. The early morning light illuminated the exhaustion on Lillian's face. "She's been colicky all night," Lillian explained, her voice strained. "I'm sorry if she woke you." "Don't apologize," Jackson said. "Can I help somehow?" Lillian shook her head. "She'll settle eventually, she always does." Jackson nodded, feeling awkward and useless. "I'll make some breakfast. The chickens should have laid by now so we can have eggs, and I've got some side meat." "Thank you," Lillian said, gratitude shining through her fatigue. "For everything, Jackson. I know I've put you in a difficult position." "You haven't put me anywhere I don't want to be," he replied firmly. "You and Emma are welcome here for as long as you need. Or want," he added, before turning to head to the kitchen. Over the next few days, they fell into a tentative routine. Jackson tended to his ranch duties, checking on the small herd of cattle, mending fences, and caring for the horses while Lillian recovered her strength. Her ankle improved enough that she could move around the house with the help of a walking stick Jackson carved for her. Lillian insisted on contributing, taking over the cooking and keeping the house tidier than it had been in years. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the vast Montana sky while Emma slept in a makeshift cradle Jackson had constructed from an old apple crate. They spoke of simple things: the weather, the animals, the changes to the ranch since Lillian had last been there. But they circled the deeper subjects like wary dancers, neither quite ready to lead. On the fifth evening, as they sat in companionable silence, Jackson finally broached one of the topics that had been weighing on his mind. "Your husband," he began carefully, watching Lillian's face tighten at the mention. "Will he come looking for you?" Lillian's hands stilled in her lap. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "Thomas is possessive. He considers Emma and me his property. He won't simply let us go." Jackson nodded, having expected as much. "Does he know about this place, about me?" "No," Lillian assured him. "I never spoke of Montana after I returned east. My father forbade it." She hesitated. "But Thomas has resources and connections if he's determined enough." "Then we'll be ready," Jackson said firmly. "This is my land, my home. You're under my protection now." Lillian looked at him, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door, Jackson. You brought yourself," he replied simply. "And that little one, that's not trouble, Lillian, that's—" He trailed off, unable to find the right words for what it meant to him. She reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. The touch sent a jolt through him, awakening feelings he'd tried to bury 4 years ago. "I thought of you," she said softly. "All those years, I thought of you and this place, and what might have been if I'd stayed." Jackson turned his hand to clasp hers. "Why didn't you write back? I sent letters for months." Pain flashed across Lillian's face. "My father intercepted them. I never knew until much later when he confessed during one of his rages. By then, I was already married to Thomas." The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. All this time, he'd thought she'd simply forgotten him, moved on to her sophisticated Eastern life without a backward glance. To learn that she'd been denied even the knowledge of his letters felt like reopening an old wound. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered, squeezing his hand. "If I had known." "It doesn't matter now," Jackson said, though they both knew it did. "You're here, that's what counts." Inside the house, Emma began to cry. Lillian withdrew her hand reluctantly and stood. "She's hungry." Jackson watched her go, his heart full of too many emotions to name. One thing was clear: the feelings he'd harbored for Lillian Voight had never truly died. They'd merely lain dormant, waiting for her return. As summer deepened, the days fell into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Jackson found himself looking forward to returning to the house after his daily work, to the sight of Lillian moving about the kitchen, or sitting in the rocking chair with Emma. The baby grew stronger and more alert each day, her dark eyes following Jackson's movements with a curiosity that delighted him. One evening in late July, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, bringing welcome rain but also startling Emma into frightened wails. Lillian paced the floor with her, trying to soothe the terrified infant, but nothing seemed to help. "May I try?" Jackson asked tentatively. Surprise flickered across Lillian's face, but she carefully transferred the crying baby to his arms. Jackson cradled Emma against his chest and began to hum a low, steady tune, an old cowboy song his father had sung to him. He walked slowly around the room, his large hand patting the baby's back in rhythm with the melody. Gradually, Emma's cries subsided to hiccuping whimpers, and then to silence as she fell asleep against his shoulder. When Jackson looked up, he found Lillian watching them with an expression that made his heart skip. Something tender and wondering shone in her eyes, something that made him feel 10 feet tall and invincible. "You're good with her," Lillian said softly. Jackson looked down at the sleeping infant, marveling at how natural it felt to hold her. "She makes it easy," he replied. That night marked a shift in their relationship. The careful distance they'd maintained began to dissolve, replaced by a growing intimacy born of shared responsibilities and rediscovered affection. August brought scorching heat that wilted the garden and drove them to seek the shade of the porch during the hottest parts of the day. Lillian would sit with her mending while Jackson whittled small wooden toys for Emma, who was now strong enough to hold her head up and regard them with solemn curiosity. "She has your eyes," Jackson commented one afternoon, watching as Emma grasped at a wooden rattle he'd made her. "And her father's chin," Lillian replied automatically, then fell silent, her expression clouding. Jackson put down his knife. "You never speak of him, of what happened." Lillian's hands stilled in her lap. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the buzzing of cicadas in the tall grass. "He was charming at first, all smiles and gentle manners. My father was impressed by his business acumen and family connections. I was resigned. I knew I would never be allowed to return west to the life I'd glimpsed here, so I tried to make the best of it." She drew a shaky breath. "The wedding night was when I first saw the other side of him. He was rough, demanding. When I cried, he told me it was my duty as a wife to please him, and that I should be grateful for his patience with my inexperience." Jackson's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, giving her space to continue. "It only got worse after that. He would be perfectly pleasant in public, the devoted husband, but behind closed doors," she shuddered. "The first time he hit me was 3 months into our marriage. I'd ordered the wrong type of whiskey for a dinner party. He apologized afterward, brought me flowers, swore it would never happen again." "But it did," Jackson said quietly. Lillian nodded, her eyes distant with painful memories. "It always did. Each time the apologies grew shorter, the incidents more frequent. When I discovered I was expecting Emma, he was pleased, proud to have proven his virility. For a while, things improved, but then he began to drink more heavily, to resent the attention my condition required." She looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her lap. "After she was born, his jealousy grew worse. He couldn't stand that she needed me, that I spent so much time caring for her. One night, he came home drunk and found me nursing her instead of waiting up for him. He flew into a rage, accused me of loving her more than him." Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. "He grabbed her from my arms and said he would teach me where my priorities should lie. I've never felt such terror, Jackson, or such rage. I don't even remember picking up the fireplace poker, but suddenly it was in my hands, and I was telling him to put my baby down or I would kill him where he stood." Jackson could picture it clearly. Lillian, her maternal fury transforming her into something fierce and dangerous. "What happened?" "He saw something in my eyes that made him believe me," Lillian said. "He put Emma back in her cradle and left the room without a word. The next morning he acted as if nothing had happened, but I knew then that I had to leave, for Emma's sake if not my own." She looked up at Jackson, her eyes clear and direct. "I waited until his next business trip, gathered what I could carry, and we left. I didn't even leave a note, I just vanished." Jackson reached over and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. You did what you had to do. You protected your child. But I've put you at risk, Lillian said, the worry evident in her voice. If Thomas finds us here, let him come, Jackson said, an edge of steel in his voice. This is my land, my home, and your. He hesitated, then finished simply, you're safe here. The unspoken words hung between them, as tangible as the heat shimmering off the distant hills. That night, after Lillian and Emma had gone to bed, Jackson sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle. The weapon had belonged to his father, a sturdy Winchester that had served them well through years of frontier life. He worked methodically, his mind turning over Lillian's story and what it meant for their future. He had no illusions about the legal realities. In the eyes of the law, Lillian was Thomas Blackburn's wife, Emma his child. Jackson had no claim to either of them. If Blackburn tracked them down, he could legally demand their return and call upon the local authorities to enforce that right if necessary. But the law of the frontier sometimes differed from the law in books. Out here, where civilization clung to the land as tentatively as morning dew, a man's home was his castle, and Jackson was prepared to defend his. The next morning brought a change in the weather, a cooler breeze that hinted at the coming autumn. Jackson found Lillian in the garden, Emma strapped to her chest in a sling as she harvested late summer vegetables. Your ankle seems fully healed, he observed, leaning on the garden fence. Lillian straightened, brushing soil from her hands. Yes, it has been for a while now, she hesitated. Jackson, I've been meaning to talk to you about our situation, his heart clenched. What about it? I can't impose on you indefinitely. Emma and I should move on, find a place of our own where Thomas won't think to look. No, Jackson said, more forcefully than he'd intended. He softened his tone. Lillian, you're not imposing. I want you here, both of you. She looked at him searchingly. Why? We've brought nothing but complication to your life. Jackson struggled to find the right words. He'd never been a man who expressed himself easily, preferring action to speech. But some things needed saying. Before you came back, he began slowly, I was existing, not living. Going through the motions day after day, this place, he gestured at the ranch around them. It was just land and buildings. Now it feels like a home again. He stepped through the garden gate, closing the distance between them. I know your situation is complicated. I know there are risks. But I'm asking you to stay, not out of obligation or because you have nowhere else to go, but because I want you here. Because when I look at you and Emma, I see. What? Lillian whispered, her eyes never leaving his face. Family, Jackson said simply. I see family. Emma chose that moment to gurgle happily, reaching out a tiny hand toward Jackson. They both laughed, the tension broken by the baby's perfect timing. Lillian's expression softened. She's grown attached to you. The feeling is mutual, Jackson said, offering his finger for Emma to grasp. To Lillian, he added, just think about it. Don't make any decisions yet. She nodded, and they finished harvesting the garden together, working side by side in comfortable silence. September brought the cattle roundup, a time when Jackson would normally have been away from the ranch for days at a stretch, working with neighboring ranchers to gather their scattered herds. This year, he hesitated to leave Lillian and Emma alone. We'll be fine, Lillian assured him. I grew up in the city, but I've learned a thing or two about ranch life. I can handle things here for a few days. Still, Jackson arranged for old Sam Miller, a retired ranch hand who lived a few miles away, to ride by daily to check on them. He left Lillian his pistol, making sure she knew how to use it, and promised to return as quickly as possible. The separation, though brief, made one thing abundantly clear to Jackson: he no longer wanted to live without Lillian and Emma in his life. The house felt empty when he returned each night to the other cowboys' camps. The endless prairie, once a source of peace, now seemed merely a barrier keeping him from home. On the third night, as the men sat around the campfire sharing coffee and stories, Jackson's thoughts kept drifting back to the ranch. He barely noticed when the conversation turned to him. Earth to read, called Jim Travers, a grizzled cowhand from the neighboring spread. You with us, son? Jackson blinked, focusing on the amused faces around the fire. Sorry, mind was elsewhere. With that pretty lady and her baby, I reckon, said Sam Miller with a knowing grin. Don't blame you none, Miss Lillian's a fine woman. Jackson stiffened. What have you been telling people, Sam? The old man raised his hands placatingly. Now, don't get your hackles up. Ain't said nothing improper, just that your cousin and her little one are staying with you for a spell. Relief washed through Jackson. Sam had given Lillian a cover-story family visiting from back east. It would buy them time and avoid awkward questions. That's right, he confirmed, catching Sam's eye with silent gratitude. My cousin Lillian and her daughter, Emma. Widow is she? Asked another cowboy, a little too casually. Yes, Jackson said firmly, the lie coming easily to protect Lillian. Lost her husband last winter, pneumonia. The men nodded solemnly, and the conversation moved on to other topics, but the exchange left Jackson thoughtful. They couldn't maintain the fiction forever. Sooner or later, questions would arise. And what then? The answer came to him with startling clarity as he bedded down under the stars that night. There was only one way to truly protect Lillian and Emma, to give them a permanent place in his life. It was what he wanted anyway, had wanted since the moment she'd returned. He would ask Lillian to marry him. The roundup concluded faster than expected, and Jackson rode home on the afternoon of the fourth day, his heart lighter than it had been in years despite the dust and fatigue of the cattle drive. As the ranch came into view, he spurred his horse to a faster pace, eager to see Lillian and Emma. The scene that greeted him as he crested the final rise froze his blood. A sleek black buggy stood in front of the house, a city vehicle, out of place in the rugged landscape. A well-dressed man was on the porch, his posture rigid with anger as he faced Lillian, who stood in the doorway with Emma clutched protectively to her chest. Thomas Blackburn had found them. Jackson urged his horse forward, closing the distance to the house in a gallop. The sound of hoofbeats drew the attention of both figures on the porch. Lillian's face showed naked relief at the sight of him. The man turned, his handsome features contorted with suspicion. Jackson dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground hard as he strode toward the porch. His hand rested casually near his holster, not a threat, but a statement. Afternoon, he said, his voice deceptively mild. Seems I have a visitor. Mr. Reed, I presume, the man said coldly. I am Thomas Blackburn. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jackson's jaw tightened at the possessive phrasing. I don't see any property of yours here, Mr. Blackburn, just two people under my protection. Blackburn's face flushed with anger. That woman is my wife, that child is my daughter. The law recognizes my right to both. The law also recognizes a woman's right not to be beaten, Jackson replied, his voice hardening, or a child's right to safety. How dare you? Blackburn sputtered. The delusions of a hysterical woman. I saw the bruises myself, Jackson cut in, climbing the porch steps to position himself between Blackburn and Lillian. When she arrived here, half dead from walking over 100 miles to escape you, Blackburn's face twisted with rage. Step aside, cowboy. This is a family matter. That's where you're wrong, Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet. Lillian and Emma are my family now, and you're trespassing on my land. The banker's hand moved toward his coat, and Jackson tensed, ready to draw. But instead of a weapon, Blackburn pulled out a folded document. I anticipated resistance, he said smugly. This is a court order, signed by Judge Hamilton in Denver, recognizing my right to retrieve my wife and child. The local sheriff has already been apprised of the situation. If you interfere, you'll be arrested. Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He'd feared something like this, but the reality was worse than he'd imagined. Lillian stepped forward, her face pale but determined. I'm not going with you, Thomas, not ever again. Blackburn's smile was chilling. You have no choice, my dear. The law is on my side, as is the church, society, and your own father. Or have you forgotten your marriage vows, to love, honor, and obey until death do us part? I'd rather die than return to you, Lillian said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. And I'll never let you near Emma again. Blackburn's facade of civility cracked. You stupid woman. Do you think I came all this way to be denied? Do you think I'll allow this? This saddle tramp to keep what's mine. He turned to Jackson, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. Step aside, or I'll have the sheriff throw you in jail and burn this pathetic excuse for a ranch to the ground." Jackson stood his ground, evaluating his options. He could draw on Blackburn. The man was clearly unarmed. But that would make him a murderer in the eyes of the law, hunted across the territory. Or he could try to reason with the man, appeal to whatever shred of humanity might exist beneath the polished exterior. Before he could decide, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 2 riders were coming fast toward the ranch, one in the unmistakable uniform of the county sheriff, the other a younger deputy. Blackburn's smile returned, triumphant now. "Right on schedule. I told Sheriff Davis I might need assistance. He seems a reasonable man who understands the sanctity of marriage." Jackson's mind raced. If the sheriff had already been convinced of Blackburn's rightful claim, they were in serious trouble. He turned to Lillian, speaking urgently and quietly. "Take Emma inside. Pack only what you need. If things go badly, be ready to leave through the back." Lillian's eyes widened, but she nodded, stepping back into the house with Emma held close. Jackson faced Blackburn again. "Whatever happens here today, know this: Lillian left you of her own free will, and she'll never be yours again. Not truly. You can force her back, but you'll have to watch her every minute of every day, because the moment you turn your back, she'll be gone again." Blackburn's smug expression faltered slightly. "She'll learn her place. They both will." The threat in his words made Jackson's fists clench, but he forced himself to remain calm as the sheriff and his deputy rode into the yard and dismounted. Sheriff Davis was a solid man in his 50s, with a weathered face that had seen its share of frontier justice. His deputy was younger, barely out of his teens, with an eager expression that suggested he was still new to the job. "Afternoon, gentlemen," the sheriff said, approaching the porch. "Mr. Blackburn, Mr. Reed." He nodded to each in turn, his expression carefully neutral. "Seems we have a situation that needs resolving." "It's quite simple, Sheriff," Blackburn said smoothly. "This man is harboring my wife and child against my wishes." "I have a court order." He held up the document again. "I've seen it," the sheriff interrupted, his tone clipped. "Mr. Reed, is Mrs. Blackburn here?" Jackson met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Lillian Voight is here, yes, along with her daughter. They came seeking refuge after fleeing an abusive situation." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those are serious allegations, Mr. Reed. They're also true," Jackson replied. "She arrived here weeks ago, half-starved, limping on a badly injured ankle with a 4-month-old baby strapped to her back. She'd walked over 100 miles to escape this man." Sheriff Davis studied Jackson's face, then looked to Blackburn, whose confident expression had taken on a brittle quality. "Mr. Blackburn, do you deny these allegations?" "Of course I deny them," Blackburn snapped. "My wife is emotionally fragile, prone to hysterics and delusions, especially since the child was born. She needs proper medical care, not the primitive conditions of this place." "I see," the sheriff said. "Well, there's a simple way to resolve this. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Blackburn myself." Before either man could respond, the door opened and Lillian stepped onto the porch. She had changed into a clean dress and tidied her hair, but it was her expression that struck Jackson, calm, determined, and unafraid. "Sheriff," she said with a slight nod. "I am Lillian Voight. I was married to Thomas Blackburn against my wishes, at my father's insistence. For 2 years, I endured his abuse, physical, emotional, and otherwise. When he threatened our daughter, I knew I had to leave." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing a faded but still visible bruise on her upper arm. "This is from the last time he grabbed me, 3 weeks before I left. I have others, older marks, and while they fade, the fear doesn't. I will not return to a man who treats me and my child as property to be controlled and punished." Sheriff Davis's expression remained impassive, but his eyes had softened slightly. "Mrs. Blackburn Voight," she interrupted firmly. "I choose to use my maiden name now." The sheriff inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Miss Voight, then. The law is clear on matters of marriage. A husband has certain rights, and what of a wife's rights?" Lillian challenged. "Or a child's? Does the law protect us at all, Sheriff?" The lawman sighed heavily. "It's complicated, madam. I understand your concerns, truly I do, but this court order is binding in this territory." Blackburn stepped forward, his confidence returning. You see, Lillian, even your cowboy can't save you from your responsibilities. Now gather the child and whatever you brought with you. We're leaving immediately. Jackson tensed, ready to intervene, but the sheriff raised a hand, silencing both men. Not so fast, Mr. Blackburn. There are procedures to follow. What procedures? Blackburn demanded. I have a court order. Yes, and it will be enforced, the sheriff said, his tone hardening. But I won't drag a woman and infant off to Denver today. It's nearly sundown, and the nearest town with suitable accommodations is 2 hours' ride from here. He turned to Lillian. Miss Voight, you have until tomorrow noon to prepare yourself and your child for the journey. I'll return then to escort you to town, where Mr. Blackburn has rooms reserved at the hotel. You'll depart for Denver the following morning on the eastbound stage. This is outrageous, Blackburn protested. You'll demand nothing on my watch, Sheriff Davis interrupted, his hand moving deliberately to rest on his holster. This is how it's going to be, unless you'd prefer to spend the night in my jail for disturbing the peace. Blackburn's mouth snapped shut, though his eyes blazed with barely contained fury. The sheriff nodded, satisfied. Mr. Blackburn, you'll return to town with us now. My deputy will accompany you to the hotel and ensure you're comfortable for the night. I'm not leaving without, that wasn't a request, the sheriff said quietly. Your court order will be fulfilled tomorrow in a manner that causes the least distress to the child. That's my final word on the matter. For a tense moment, it seemed Blackburn might continue to argue. Then with a curt nod, he turned and stalked toward his buggy. Tomorrow then, but not a day more. The young deputy hurried after him while Sheriff Davis lingered on the porch. Once Blackburn was out of earshot, he spoke in a low voice to Jackson and Lillian. I'm giving you until noon tomorrow. What you do with that time is your business. His weathered face softened slightly. I've known men like Blackburn before. The law may be on his side, but that doesn't make him right. Lillian's eyes widened in understanding. Sheriff, are you suggesting? Davis adjusted his hat, his expression deliberately neutral. I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Voight. I'm simply informing you of when I'll return to enforce a legal court order. What happens between now and then is not my concern. He glanced at Jackson. Reed, you've always been a good neighbor. It would pain me to find you in violation of the law. With that cryptic statement, he tipped his hat and strode back to his horse. They watched in silence as he rode away, following Blackburn's buggy toward town. As the dust settled, Jackson turned to Lillian, who stood clutching Emma tightly to her chest. We have until noon tomorrow, he said, his mind already racing with plans. The sheriff just gave us a chance. A chance to what? Lillian asked, her voice trembling slightly. To run. Where would we go? Thomas has connections everywhere. He'd find us eventually. Jackson took her hands, his grip firm and reassuring. Not everywhere. There's a place I know up in the mountains, my father's old hunting cabin. It's remote, hard to find if you don't know the way. We could go there, at least until we figure out something more permanent. Hope flickered in Lillian's eyes, but doubt quickly followed. What about the ranch, your cattle? You've worked so hard to build this place. None of it matters without you, Jackson said simply. Without both of you. The words hung between them, charged with everything they'd left unspoken these past weeks. Lillian's eyes searched his, finding nothing but sincerity. Jackson, she whispered, I can't ask you to give up everything you're not asking, he interrupted gently. I'm offering. More than that, I'm choosing. I choose you, Lillian. I choose Emma. I choose us. Emma squirmed in Lillian's arms, reaching toward Jackson as she had so many times before. Without hesitation, he took the baby, cradling her against his chest with practiced ease. We're a family now, he said softly. Or we could be if you want that too, Lillian's breath caught. Are you saying? I'm saying I love you, Jackson said, the words finally free after years of being held captive in his heart. I think I've loved you since that first summer you spent here teaching the children. I never stopped, not even when you left, and now I love Emma too, as if she were my own. Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. I love you too, Jackson. I think I always have, even when I tried to forget you, to be the dutiful daughter and wife I was expected to be. Jackson shifted Emma to one arm and pulled Lillian close with the other. Then let's be a family, properly. We can find a preacher in one of the mountain settlements, start fresh where Blackburn can't reach us. Yes, Lillian breathed against his chest. Yes to all of it. As the sun began to set over the Montana plains, casting long shadows across the land they would soon leave behind, Jackson Reed held his newfound family close and felt, for the first time in years, truly at home. The night passed in a flurry of preparation. They packed only what they could carry: food, clothing, a few precious keepsakes, and supplies for Emma. Jackson wrote a letter to his nearest neighbor, arranging for the care of his cattle and horses until he could return or make more permanent arrangements. He also penned a brief note for Sheriff Davis, thanking him for his understanding and promising to make things right someday. As dawn broke, they were ready. Jackson had saddled his most reliable horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Thunder, and prepared a pack horse with their essential supplies. Lillian had fashioned a secure carrier for Emma that would allow her to ride safely between them. "It's a 2-day journey to the cabin," Jackson explained as they prepared to mount. "The trail gets rough in places, but Thunder can handle it. We'll need to be careful, move only during daylight, and avoid the main paths." Lillian nodded, her face determined despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "We'll manage. We have to." Jackson helped her into the saddle, then carefully handed Emma up to her. The baby, sensing the tension, was unusually quiet, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar preparations. With one last look at the ranch that had been his home for so many years, Jackson mounted behind Lillian, his arms encircling her and Emma protectively as he took the reins. "Ready?" he asked softly. Lillian leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Ready." They set off as the first golden rays of sunlight touched the eastern hills, heading west toward the distant mountains. Jackson deliberately chose a roundabout route, crossing a shallow stream several times to obscure their tracks. By mid-morning, they had left the open plains behind and entered the foothills, where pine forests offered cover and the terrain grew increasingly difficult to navigate. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and feed Emma. Lillian's face was drawn with fatigue, but her spirit remained unbroken. "Do you think they're following yet?" she asked as Jackson helped her dismount. He scanned the trail behind them, seeing nothing but empty wilderness. "The sheriff won't come until noon, as promised, but Blackburn, I wouldn't put it past him to try something earlier." Lillian shivered despite the warmth of the day. "He's not a man who accepts defeat easily." "Neither am I," Jackson said firmly, drawing her into his arms. "We've got a good head start, and I know these mountains better than any city man. We'll be fine." They rested only long enough to regain their strength, then continued their journey. The trail steepened as they climbed higher into the mountains, following game paths and logging routes that few travelers would know. By late afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that offered a view back toward the plains. Jackson reined in, staring at the distant landscape with a frown. Far below, barely visible through the trees, a plume of dust marked the passage of riders, at least 3, moving fast along the main trail toward the mountains. "Blackburn?" Lillian asked, following his gaze. "Possibly," Jackson admitted, "or it could be ordinary travelers. Either way, we should keep moving. There's a place ahead where we can camp for the night, a small canyon with a spring. It's defensible and off the main paths." They pushed on, the horses picking their way carefully along the increasingly treacherous trail. Emma, remarkably, seemed to be taking the journey in stride, sleeping securely in her carrier or watching the passing scenery with wide-eyed fascination. As dusk approached, they reached the canyon Jackson had described. Steep walls rose on 3 sides, offering protection from the wind and prying eyes. A clear spring bubbled from the rocks, providing fresh water, and a small meadow offered grazing for the horses. Jackson helped Lillian and Emma dismount, then quickly set about making camp. He built a small, nearly smokeless fire using dry pine needles and twigs, positioned where the canyon walls would hide even that minimal light. They ate a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and dried fruit, speaking little but drawing comfort from each other's presence. As full darkness fell, Emma finally surrendered to sleep, cradled in a nest of blankets. Lillian sat beside her, gently stroking the baby's dark hair. "She's so resilient," she said softly, "so trusting that we'll keep her safe." Jackson settled beside them, wrapping an arm around Lillian's shoulders. "We will," he promised. "Whatever it takes." Lillian leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his chest. "I never imagined my life would take this turn," she confessed. "When my father sent for me 4 years ago, I thought that was the end of my happiness. That I would live the life he planned for me, married to a man of his choosing, raising children in a loveless home." "And now?" Jackson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the dying embers of their fire. "Now I'm running for my life with a man I love and a daughter I would die to protect. I'm terrified. And yet, I've never felt more alive." Jackson brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "When we reach the cabin, when we're truly safe, I want to marry you properly, if you'll have me." "Yes," Lillian said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. He leaned down and kissed her then, a tender meeting of lips that held the promise of all their tomorrows. When they parted, both were smiling despite the danger that still pursued them. "We should rest," Jackson said reluctantly. "Tomorrow will be another long day." They settled beside Emma, huddled together for warmth and comfort, and if sleep came fitfully amid their concerns, it came nonetheless. Dawn found them already awake and preparing to continue their journey. Jackson studied the terrain ahead, planning their route carefully. "The cabin is about 6 hours' ride from here, assuming we don't run into trouble," he explained. "The trail gets rougher from this point, but also less traveled. If anyone is following us, they'll have a harder time tracking us." They mounted up as the first light filtered into the canyon, Emma secure in her carrier and seemingly content despite the early hour. Jackson led them up a nearly invisible game trail that wound through dense forest, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. By mid-morning, they had reached a high alpine meadow dotted with wildflowers and surrounded by towering peaks. In other circumstances, it would have been a breathtaking sight to savor. Now, they paused only long enough to rest the horses and scan their back trail for pursuers. "I don't see anything," Lillian said, shading her eyes as she looked back the way they had come. Jackson nodded, but his expression remained wary. "That doesn't mean they're not there. The forest is thick enough to hide an army." They pressed on, following a rocky ridge that offered both a clear path and good visibility of the surrounding landscape. The air grew cooler as they climbed, the pine forests giving way to more rugged terrain. It was nearly noon when disaster struck. Thunder, stepping carefully across a scree slope, dislodged a large rock that clattered down the mountainside, triggering a minor avalanche of stones and dirt. The noise echoed across the valley below them. Jackson cursed under his breath. If anyone is within a mile of here, they heard that. They quickened their pace as much as safety would allow, pushing the tired horses to their limits. Emma, sensing the tension, began to fuss in her carrier. "SHH, sweet one," Lillian soothed, stroking the baby's cheek. "Just a little longer." They had just crossed a small stream when Jackson reined in sharply, his body tensing. Lillian followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. On a parallel ridge perhaps half a mile away, 3 riders had appeared, moving in the same direction. "Is it them?" she whispered. "Can't be sure from this distance," Jackson replied, his voice tight. "But they're following our route too closely for comfort. We need to change course." He turned Thunder away from the open ridge, guiding them into a dense stand of pines that offered concealment. The going was slower here, with low branches that forced them to duck and uneven ground that the horses navigated with cautious steps. For nearly an hour, they moved through the forest in tense silence, stopping occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit. Emma, miraculously, had fallen asleep despite the uncomfortable journey, her tiny face peaceful against Lillian's chest. They emerged from the trees onto a narrow ledge that skirted the edge of a steep ravine. Below, a fast-moving stream tumbled over rocks, the water white with foam. Ahead, the ledge widened into a small plateau where several trails converged. "The cabin is just beyond that rise," Jackson said, pointing to a wooded hill ahead. "If we can reach it without being seen, we'll have shelter and a defensible position." They had just started across the exposed ledge when a shout echoed from behind them. Turning, they saw 2 riders emerge from the trees they had just left. Even at this distance, There was no mistaking Thomas Blackburn's elegant city clothes and rigid posture. Beside him rode a rough-looking man with a rifle balanced across his saddle. Jackson. Lillian gasped, clutching Emma tighter. "Keep going," he urged, spurring Thunder forward. "Don't stop for anything." The packhorse, startled by the sudden movement, balked momentarily before following. That brief hesitation was enough for the pursuing riders to spot them. There they are. Blackburn's voice carried across the distance, filled with triumph and rage. After them, Jackson and Lillian raced along the ledge, the horses' hooves sending small showers of rocks into the ravine below. Behind them, their pursuers followed, closing the distance with every passing moment. They reached the plateau just as a rifle shot cracked through the mountain air. The bullet whined off the rocks several feet to their left, a warning shot, not meant to hit them, but close enough to demonstrate the shooter's skill. "Stop right there, Reed," called an unfamiliar voice, the rifleman, presumably. "Next one won't miss." Jackson pulled Thunder to a halt, his mind racing. They were still a quarter-mile from the cabin, too exposed here on the plateau to make a run for it. He turned slowly to face their pursuers, positioning his horse to keep Lillian and Emma partially shielded behind him. Blackburn and his companion approached cautiously, the rifleman keeping his weapon trained on Jackson. The third rider was nowhere to be seen, perhaps circling around to cut off their escape route. "Well, well," Blackburn said as they drew closer, his cultured voice dripping with disdain. "The gallant cowboy and his stolen prizes. Did you really think you could outrun civilization, Reed?" "There's nothing civilized about what you do to your wife and child," Jackson replied, his voice steady despite the danger. Blackburn's handsome face twisted with anger. "My wife. My child, mine by law and by right. Step aside and I might let you live." The rifleman, a weathered man with cold eyes, shifted his weapon slightly. "Do as he says, mister. I got no quarrel with you personally, but I'm being paid well to bring these two back." Jackson remained where he was, one hand resting near his holster. "Lillian," he said without turning, "if anything happens, ride for the cabin. Don't stop, don't look back." "Jackson, no," she protested, her voice thick with fear. "You think she can outrun a bullet?" Blackburn asked, his tone almost conversational. "How touching, this devotion you've inspired, Lillian, but it ends now. Come here with my daughter." "She's not going anywhere with you," Jackson said firmly. "Not today, not ever." Blackburn's patience visibly snapped. "Enough of this. Harper, if he doesn't move in the next 5 seconds, shoot him." The rifleman Harper nodded grimly and raised his weapon. "Sorry, friend, just business." Time seemed to slow for Jackson as he assessed his options. He could draw on Harper, might even get a shot off, but the odds of hitting the man before taking a bullet himself were slim. Even if he succeeded, there was still Blackburn and the missing third rider to contend with. Just as Harper began to squeeze the trigger, a new voice rang out from the trees to their right. "Drop it, Harper. You're aiming at a friend of the law." All heads turned to see Sheriff Davis emerge from the pines, his revolver drawn and steady. Behind him came his young deputy, similarly armed. Harper hesitated, clearly calculating his chances. "This ain't your jurisdiction, Sheriff." "Close enough," Davis replied. "And harboring a fugitive is a federal offense. That young deputy behind me, his father's the federal marshal for this territory. Drop the rifle nice and slow." With a muttered curse, Harper lowered his weapon. Blackburn was less compliant. "This is outrageous. I have a court order signed by a judge who's currently under investigation for taking bribes," the sheriff interrupted. "Interesting coincidence that. Seems several wealthy gentlemen have received very favorable rulings from Judge Hamilton recently, rulings that are now being reviewed." The blood drained from Blackburn's face. "You can't." "I already have," Davis said. "Sent a telegram to Denver yesterday evening. Got a reply this morning from the territorial governor himself. Your court order, Mr. Blackburn, isn't worth the paper it's written on." Hope surged through Jackson, but he remained cautious. "What about the third rider?" The sheriff smiled thinly. "Mr. Johnson decided to accept my deputy's invitation to lay down his weapons when we encountered him circling around behind you. He's currently enjoying the hospitality of a sturdy pine tree and some good rope." Blackburn's composure crumbled completely. "This is illegal. I'll have your badge." You'll be silent, Sheriff Davis snapped, his patience clearly at an end. Or I'll add threatening an officer of the law to the charges against you, and those charges, Mr. Blackburn, are already considerable. He turned to Lillian, his expression softening. Miss Voight, I took the liberty of speaking with Dr. Wilson in town last night. He recalled treating you for accidents during your visit last year. He's prepared to testify about your injuries if needed. Tears of relief filled Lillian's eyes. Thank you, Sheriff. Davis nodded, then addressed Jackson. You two planning to head back to the ranch anytime soon? It's being well looked after, but those cattle of yours are probably missing their master. Jackson glanced at Lillian, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, sir, he replied. I think we are. Good, the sheriff said, because I've got a preacher friend passing through next week. Thought he might be of service if you two were interested in making certain arrangements official. A slow smile spread across Jackson's face. I believe we might be, Sheriff. The journey back to the ranch was considerably less harrowing than their flight into the mountains had been. Sheriff Davis and his deputy escorted Blackburn and his hired guns back to town, where they would face various charges: assault, falsifying court documents, and crossing territorial lines in pursuit of criminal activity among them. It won't be enough, Lillian worried as they rode homeward, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier. Thomas has connections, money, he'll find a way out of this. Maybe, Jackson conceded, but he'll be occupied for quite some time, and we'll be ready if he ever comes back. The ranch looked exactly as they had left it, a simple, sturdy homestead standing resolute against the vast Montana landscape. As they rode into the yard, Jackson felt a profound sense of homecoming, deeper than he'd ever experienced before. That evening, after settling Emma in her cradle and seeing to the horses, Jackson and Lillian sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaned against his chest. Are you sure about this? Lillian asked softly. Marrying me, taking on another man's child, possibly facing Thomas's vengeance someday. Jackson tilted her face up to his eyes serious in the fading light. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Lillian Voight. I love Emma as if she were my own daughter. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Together, she echoed, the word a promise. I like the sound of that. 1 week later, as promised, Sheriff Davis arrived with Reverend Michael Collins, a traveling preacher known throughout the territory for his compassion and wisdom. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, witnessed by a few neighboring ranchers and their families who had known Jackson for years. Lillian wore a dress of pale blue calico, with wildflowers in her hair and Emma in her arms. Jackson had never seen a more beautiful sight as she walked toward him, her face radiant with happiness and hope. Dearly beloved, the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the ranch yard where they had chosen to exchange their vows. We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The words were traditional, but the meaning behind them was anything but ordinary for Jackson and Lillian. Each promise, each vow, carried the weight of all they had overcome to reach this moment. I, Jackson, take you, Lillian, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Jackson said, his voice clear and steady. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Lillian's voice trembled slightly as she repeated the same vows, but her eyes never left his, shining with certainty and love. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and well wishes. Emma, startled by the noise, began to cry, and Jackson instinctively reached for her, soothing her with the gentle confidence he'd developed over the past months. Looks like you're already a natural father, Sheriff Davis observed with a smile. I had good teachers, Jackson replied, thinking of his own parents who had shown him what a loving family should be. And I have the best possible reasons to get it right. The celebration continued into the evening, with food and music and laughter filling the ranch house that had once seemed so empty. As the last guests departed, Sheriff Davis pulled Jackson aside for a private word. Got news from Denver this morning, he said in a low voice. Blackburn's being held for trial, but his lawyer's already working on bail. He's got friends in high places, as expected. Jackson nodded grimly. How long do you think we have? Hard to say. Months, maybe. The territorial governor's interested in the case. Corruption in the courts makes him look bad. He'll want to make an example of Judge Hamilton, at least. The sheriff clasped Jackson's shoulder. You've got time to prepare anyway, and friends who'll watch your back. Thank you, Jackson said sincerely, for everything. After the sheriff left, Jackson found Lillian in Emma's room, singing softly to the sleepy infant. He stood in the doorway for a moment, committing the scene to memory: his wife, his daughter, his family. She's almost asleep, Lillian whispered as she sensed his presence. She had quite an exciting day. Jackson crossed the room to stand beside them, gently stroking Emma's dark hair. The first of many, he promised, a lifetime of them. Lillian leaned against him, her new wedding ring catching the lamplight. I never thought I could be this happy, she confessed. After everything that happened with Thomas, I was afraid to hope for anything good again. Hope is stubborn that way, Jackson said, smiling down at her. It keeps coming back, no matter how many times life tries to beat it down. Like us, Lillian observed, exactly like us. As autumn gave way to winter, the Reed Ranch settled into a new rhythm. Jackson threw himself into preparations for the cold months ahead, ensuring the cattle had shelter and feed, stocking the cellars with preserved food, and reinforcing the house against the fierce Montana winds. Lillian proved herself an equal partner in these efforts, managing the household with efficiency and warmth while caring for Emma. The baby thrived under their joint attention, growing stronger and more curious with each passing day. In December, the first heavy snow blanketed the land, transforming the ranch into a pristine wonderland of white. Lillian stood at the window, Emma in her arms, watching as Jackson fought his way through the drifts to check on the animals in the barn. That's your papa, she told the baby softly. The bravest, kindest man I've ever known. Emma babbled happily in response, her chubby hands reaching toward the window. Later that evening, as they sat before the fireplace, Emma asleep in her cradle nearby, Jackson shared the news Sheriff Davis had brought on his last visit. Thomas Blackburn has been released on bail, he said, watching Lillian's face carefully. The trial is set for spring, but he's free until then. Fear flickered in her eyes, but she straightened her shoulders resolutely. Do you think he'll come back here? I don't know, Jackson admitted. The sheriff says the conditions of his bail forbid him from leaving Colorado territory, but money and influence can change those conditions, Lillian finished. I know Thomas. He doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive what he sees as betrayal. Jackson took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We'll be ready, Lil. The neighbors are all watching for strangers. The sheriff has deputies riding regular patrols, and I've made sure the house is secure. She nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. We can't live in fear forever. No, he agreed. We'll live in love instead. The rest will take care of itself. Christmas came, bringing a brief respite from their concerns. They celebrated simply but joyfully, exchanging modest gifts and preparing a special meal. Jackson had carved a wooden horse for Emma, who was delighted by the toy even though she was still too young to appreciate its significance. Her first Christmas, Lillian said, watching the baby examine the polished wood with solemn concentration. The first of many happy ones, I hope. Count on it, Jackson promised, pulling his wife close. January brought the harshest weather of the season, howling blizzards that confined them to the house for days at a time, broken by brief periods of brutal cold and blinding sunshine. During one such calm between storms, Jackson ventured out to check the cattle in the sheltered valley where they wintered. He was halfway back to the ranch house when he spotted tracks in the snow, a single horse, its rider having circled the property before heading toward the main road. The tracks were fresh, made since the last snowfall the previous night. Jackson followed them for a while, his hand resting on his holster, but they led away from the ranch rather than toward it. Still, the discovery left him unsettled. A neighbor would have come to the house, not circled it from a distance. A stranger with innocent intentions would have done the same. That night, he added extra logs to the fire and checked his rifle before retiring, placing it within easy reach of the bed. Lillian watched his preparations with knowing eyes but said nothing, her own fears mirrored in his actions. They settled into bed, Emma asleep in her cradle nearby. Jackson had insisted on moving her into their room temporarily, unwilling to have her out of reach with unknown visitors in the area. "Do you think it was him?" Lillian finally asked in the darkness, her voice barely audible. Jackson pulled her closer, offering what comfort he could. "I don't know. Could have been a traveler seeking shelter who changed his mind, could have been someone hunting strays, could have been anything." But they both knew what it most likely was Thomas Blackburn, or someone working for him, scouting the property. Preparing, the next morning dawned clear and cold, the world outside their windows a dazzling expanse of white broken only by the dark shapes of the outbuildings and corrals. Jackson rose early, checked on the still sleeping Emma, and kissed Lillian before heading out to tend to the morning chores. He had just reached the barn when the shot rang out. The bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe mere inches from his head. Jackson dove for cover, drawing his revolver as he rolled behind a water trough. His eyes scanned the surrounding landscape, seeking the source of the shot. There a flash of movement near the old cottonwood at the edge of the property. A figure in a dark coat, partially concealed by the massive trunk. "Show yourself," Jackson called out, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "This is private property." No answer came, but another shot whistled past, closer this time. Jackson returned fire, aiming for the tree rather than the shooter, hoping to force them into the open. A shout from the house drew his attention momentarily. Lillian stood in the doorway, her expression panicked. "Get inside," Jackson yelled, gesturing urgently. "Lock the door." She disappeared back into the house, just as another shot kicked up snow at Jackson's feet. This was no warning whoever was shooting was getting more accurate with each attempt. Taking advantage of a brief lull, Jackson sprinted for the relative safety of the chicken coop, a small structure that offered better cover than the water trough. From this new position, he had a clearer view of the cottonwood and the figure who now emerged from behind it. The man was tall and lean, dressed in the practical garb of a hired gun rather than the elegant attire Jackson associated with Thomas Blackburn. A mercenary, then someone paid to do the banker's dirty work. "You read," the man called out, keeping his rifle trained in Jackson's direction. "Who's asking?" Jackson replied, not revealing his position. "Got a message for you from Mr. Blackburn," the gunman said. "Says his wife and child better be on the eastbound stage by the end of the week, or he'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." Anger surged through Jackson, hot and fierce. "They're not his anymore," he shouted back. "And if Blackburn wants them, he can come get them himself instead of sending hired trash." The insult hit its mark. With a curse, the gunman fired rapidly, the bullets peppering the chicken coop and sending splinters flying. The hens inside squawked in terrified protest, adding to the chaos. Jackson waited for a break in the firing, then risked a quick look around the edge of the coop. The gunman was advancing, moving from tree to tree for cover. The man's confidence suggested he believed Jackson was pinned down, possibly wounded. It was a dangerous assumption for the gunman. Jackson had grown up on this land, knew every inch of it intimately. While the hired gun was focused on the chicken coop, Jackson slipped out the back, using a depression in the ground to remain hidden as he circled around. The gunman reached the coop and kicked the door open, rifle at the ready. Finding only panicked chickens inside, he cursed again and began to turn too late. "Drop it," Jackson ordered, his revolver pressed against the back of the man's head. Nice and slow, the rifle clattered to the snow. "You're making a mistake," the gunman said, his voice tight with anger. "Blackburn won't stop with one warning. He wants what's his." "They're not his," Jackson repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you're going to carry a message back to him for me." With swift movements, he disarmed the man completely, finding a revolver and hunting knife in addition to the rifle. "Now turn around, slowly." The gunman complied, his face a mask of cold defiance. He was younger than Jackson had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much violence in his short life. "Here's my message for Blackburn," Jackson said, keeping his revolver trained steadily on the man. Lillian and Emma Reed are my family now, legally and in every way that matters. If he or anyone working for him comes within a mile of this ranch again, they won't leave alive. I won't aim for the doorframe next time," the gunman sneered. "Big talk from a man who ambushed me from behind." "Smart talk from a man protecting his family," Jackson corrected. "Now start walking. Your horse is tethered by the cottonwood, I assume?" He marched the disarmed gunman across the snow-covered yard, maintaining a careful distance. As they approached the main road, a rider appeared in the distance, coming fast. Jackson tensed, wondering if Blackburn had sent more than one hired gun. But as the rider drew closer, he recognized the familiar figure of Sheriff Davis. "Everything all right, Reed?" The sheriff called as he reined in his horse, his eyes narrowed at the sight of the disarmed man. "Who's your friend?" Messenger from Thomas Blackburn, Jackson explained tersely. Delivered a threat, then tried to deliver some lead to go with it. Davis dismounted, his expression grim. "That's so." He turned to the gunman. "Got a name, mister?" The man remained sullenly silent. "He was just leaving," Jackson said, with a return message for his employer. The sheriff studied both men, then nodded slowly. "I'll make sure he delivers it. And maybe add one of my own about what happens to folks who cross territorial lines with intent to commit violence." Relief washed through Jackson. With the sheriff present, he could return to Lillian and Emma, assure them the danger had passed for now, at least. "His horse is by the cottonwood," he told Davis, "and his weapons are by the chicken coop." The sheriff nodded again. "Go on back to your family, Reed. I'll handle this." Jackson didn't need to be told twice. He holstered his revolver and strode quickly toward the house, where he could see Lillian watching anxiously through the window. Emma clutched tightly in her arms. As he reached the porch, the door flew open and Lillian rushed out to meet him. "Jackson, I heard shots. Are you hurt?" He gathered her and Emma into his embrace, his heart rate finally beginning to slow. "I'm fine, not a scratch. The sheriff arrived just in time to help with our unwelcome visitor." Lillian peered past him to where Davis was securing the gunman's hands behind his back. "It was Thomas, wasn't it? He sent someone to find us." "Yes," Jackson admitted, seeing no point in shielding her from the truth. "But the sheriff will make sure this one carries a strong message back, and will be ready if Blackburn tries again." Emma, oblivious to the danger they had faced, gurgled happily and reached for Jackson's face. He caught her tiny hand in his, marveling as always at the perfect miniature fingers. "She needs a father who will be there to watch her grow," he said softly. "I intend to be that man, Lil. No matter what it takes." The gunman's arrival marked the beginning of a tense period for the Reed family. Sheriff Davis increased patrols in the area and advised neighboring ranchers to report any strangers immediately. Jackson never ventured far from the house without his revolver, and he taught Lillian to shoot with steady hands and clear eyes. "I hope I never have to use this," she said after a particularly successful practice session where she'd hit the makeshift target repeatedly. "So do I," Jackson agreed. "But if the need arises, you'll be ready." January gave way to February, which brought slightly milder weather and longer days. Emma celebrated her first birthday, not her actual birth date, which would come in the summer, but 1 year since her arrival at the ranch. They marked the occasion with a small cake and a new dress Lillian had sewn from fabric ordered from the general store in town. "She's growing so fast," Lillian marveled as Emma took tentative steps from the sofa to the rocking chair, her little face scrunched in concentration. "Soon she'll be running everywhere, just like her mama," Jackson said with a fond smile, "always in motion." Life settled into a cautious routine. No more gunmen appeared, no more tracks were discovered circling the property. Gradually, the constant vigilance eased, though it never disappeared entirely. In early March, a letter arrived from Denver, not from Blackburn, as they had feared, but from an attorney representing the territorial governor. "They want me to testify at Thomas's trial," Lillian said, her hands trembling slightly as she read the formal request. "About the abuse. They say it's important to establish a pattern of behavior, especially since he's facing other charges now." Jackson took the letter, scanning its contents with a frown. "You don't have to go," he said firmly. "We can write back, explain that it's too dangerous." Lillian shook her head, a new resolve hardening in her eyes. No, I want to go. I need to go, Jackson. Not just for the case against Thomas, but for myself. I ran away once. I won't run again. He studied her face, seeing the strength that had always been there, now tempered by adversity into something unbreakable. Then we'll all go, he decided. Together, I won't let you face him alone. The journey to Denver was arranged with careful attention to security. Sheriff Davis would accompany them, along with 2 deputies. They would travel by stagecoach to Cheyenne, then by train the rest of the way, a reversal of Lillian's desperate flight nearly a year earlier. As they prepared for the trip, Jackson found himself thinking often of that day when Lillian had appeared on the horizon, limping toward the ranch with Emma on her back. How close they had come to missing each other if he had been in the barn instead of on the porch, if she had collapsed before reaching the house, if any number of small factors had been different. What are you thinking about? Lillian asked, catching him lost in thought as he packed his best shirt for the trial. The day you came home, he said simply. How tired and afraid you looked, how brave you were to make that journey. She smiled, the memory no longer as painful as it once had been. I wasn't thinking clearly, to be honest. I just knew I had to get Emma somewhere safe, and the only safe place I could imagine was with you. Jackson drew her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. I'm glad you thought of me, of us, always, she whispered against his chest. Even when I couldn't say it, couldn't write it, couldn't acknowledge it even to myself, you were always in my heart. Jackson Reed. The trial was set for the first week of April. They arrived in Denver 3 days prior, staying in a small hotel recommended by the attorney for its discretion and security. Emma, now toddling confidently and babbling a growing vocabulary of words, was fascinated by the city sights and sounds so different from the quiet ranch. On the morning Lillian was scheduled to testify, she dressed with particular care in a simple but elegant blue dress that emphasized her quiet dignity. Jackson, wearing his one good suit, felt awkward and constrained but determined to present a respectable appearance for her sake. You look beautiful, he told her as she pinned her hair into a neat arrangement. Strong. She met his eyes in the mirror, her expression a complex mixture of fear and determination. I feel like I might be sick. That's perfectly normal, he assured her, but remember he can't hurt you anymore. Not you, not Emma, and I'll be right there in the courtroom. The territorial courthouse was an imposing stone building in the heart of Denver. Inside, the courtroom was already crowded with spectators when they arrived. A high-profile case involving a prominent banker had drawn considerable attention. Sheriff Davis escorted them to seats near the front, positioning himself protectively beside them. The attorney for the territory, a serious-looking man named Howard Grant, came to speak with Lillian briefly before the proceedings began. Just tell the truth as you experienced it, Mrs. Reed, he advised. Don't embellish, don't minimize. The facts will speak for themselves. When Thomas Blackburn was led into the courtroom, Jackson felt Lillian tense beside him. Her hand sought his, gripping it tightly as her former husband took his place at the defense table. Blackburn looked thinner than Jackson had expected, the months in custody having stripped away some of his polished appearance. But the arrogance remained in his posture. In the dismissive glance he swept over the courtroom until his eyes landed on Lillian. For just an instant, naked hatred flashed across his face, quickly masked by a composed expression as his attorney leaned over to whisper something in his ear. He still thinks he's going to win, Lillian murmured, her voice barely audible. He's wrong, Jackson replied with quiet certainty. The trial proceeded with the formality of legal proceedings, opening statements. Initial witnesses who testified to other aspects of Blackburn's criminal activities, including bribery of officials and fraudulent business practices. When Lillian was finally called to the stand, she walked forward with her head held high, though Jackson could see the slight tremor in her hands. She swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and steady. Then, under Grant's careful questioning, she began to recount her experiences as Thomas Blackburn's wife. Jackson had heard parts of the story before, but never in such detail. The systematic cruelty, the escalating violence, The way Blackburn had isolated her from potential allies, it painted a picture of calculated brutality that made his blood boil. Throughout her testimony, Lillian remained composed, her dignity a rebuke to the man who had tried to break her spirit. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his approach was predictably brutal. He suggested Lillian was unstable, that she had invented or exaggerated the abuse, that she had abandoned her husband out of selfish desire rather than legitimate fear. "And isn't it true, Mrs. Blackburn," the lawyer said with deliberate emphasis on the name, "that you fled not out of fear, but because you wished to pursue a relationship with Mr. Reed? A relationship that possibly began during your first stay in Montana, before your marriage." Murmurs swept through the courtroom at the insinuation. Jackson half rose from his seat, only to be restrained by Sheriff Davis's firm hand on his shoulder. Lillian's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "My name is Lillian Reed, and no, that is not true. I fled because my husband threatened our infant daughter while in a drunken rage. I fled because I feared for our lives. The fact that I found safety and eventually love with Jackson Reed came after, not before, my decision to leave a dangerous marriage." The defense attorney pressed on, but Lillian's calm, factual responses gradually undermined his attempts to discredit her. When she was finally allowed to step down from the witness stand, Jackson thought she had never looked stronger or more beautiful. The trial continued for 3 more days, with additional witnesses and evidence presented by both sides. On the final day, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. "We find the defendant, Thomas Blackburn, guilty on all counts," the foreman announced to the packed courtroom. A collective gasp and murmur swept through the observers. Blackburn himself showed little reaction beyond a tightening of his jaw and a brief, venomous glance toward Lillian. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison, a severe punishment that reflected both the financial crimes and the pattern of abuse established by Lillian's testimony. As Blackburn was led away by guards, he passed close to where Jackson and Lillian sat. "This isn't over," he hissed, low enough that only they could hear. "I'll find you both when I get out, I never forget." Before Jackson could respond, the guards pulled Blackburn along and he was gone from the courtroom. Lillian released a shaky breath, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. 15 years, she whispered. "Emma will be a young woman by then. And we'll be ready if he ever tries to make good on that threat," Jackson promised. "But for now, it's over. You did it, Lil. You stood up to him and you won." The return journey to Montana felt like a true homecoming. As the train and then the stagecoach carried them steadily westward, Lillian's spirits seemed to lighten with each mile. By the time they crossed back into Montana territory, she was smiling more freely than Jackson had ever seen. "It feels like a new beginning," she said as the stagecoach rolled through the familiar landscape. "Like we can finally look forward instead of always looking over our shoulders." Emma, tired of being confined in the coach, squirmed in Lillian's lap and pointed excitedly out the window. "Home," she declared with the perfect confidence of a child who knew where she belonged. "That's right, sweetheart," Jackson agreed, ruffling her dark curls. "We're going home." The ranch looked peaceful in the gentle spring sunshine, the buildings solid and welcoming against the backdrop of greening hills. As Jackson helped Lillian and Emma down from the stagecoach, he felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where they belonged, the 3 of them together. That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Jackson and Lillian sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm encircled her waist, and between them lay a comfortable silence born of shared understanding. "What do you think about adding on to the house?" Jackson asked eventually. "Maybe a bigger room for Emma as she grows, and perhaps another bedroom someday." "For a brother or sister." Lillian tilted her face up to his, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I think that sounds perfect," she said softly. "A home that grows with our family." He leaned down to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that held the promise of all their tomorrows. When they parted, both were smiling. "I love you, Lillian Reed," Jackson whispered against her hair. "You and Emma are the best things that ever walked into my life." "Even when we arrived in such sorry shape," she teased. Dirty and tired and half-starved, especially then, he said seriously. Because that's when I knew what courage really looked like, what love really meant. She nestled closer against him, her voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about that day, about what you said when I couldn't walk any further. Stay, Jackson remembered. I told you to stay. And I did, Lillian said. It was the best decision I ever made. As the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, two people who had found in each other not just love, but home, the place where they were truly seen, truly known, and truly cherished. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid and secure, sheltering their sleeping daughter. Before them stretched the vast Montana night, full of stars and possibilities. They had walked a long, difficult road to reach this point. But now, together, they had all the time in the world to simply be a family, whole and complete, exactly where they belonged.